Hello. Today I'm going to be reading Chapter 3 of The Call of the Wild, the first part of Chapter 3. The Dominant Primordial Beast. The dominant primordial beast was strong in buck, and under the fierce conditions of trial life, it grew and grew. Yet it was a secret growth. His newborn cunning gave him poise and control. He was too busy adjusting himself to the new life to feel at ease. And not only did he not pick fights, he avoided them whenever possible. A certain deliberateness characterized his attitude. He was not prone to rashness and precipitate action, and in the bitter hatred between him and Spitz, he betrayed no impatience, shunned all offensive actions. On the other hand, possibly because he divined in Buck a dangerous rival, Spitz never lost an opportunity of showing his teeth. He even went out of his way to bully Buck, striving constantly to start the fight, which could end only in the death of one or another. Early in the trip, this might have taken place had it not been for an unwanted accident. At the end of the day, they made a break and miserable camp on the shore of Lake Lebarge, driving down a wind that cut like a white-hot knife, and darkness had forced them to grope for a camping place. They could hardly have fared worse. As their backs rose, a particular wall of rock, and Perrault and Francois were compelled to make their fire and spread their sleeping ropes on the ice of the lake itself. The tent they had discarded at day in order to travel light. A few sticks of driftwood furnished them with a fire that thawed down through the ice and left them to eat supper in the dark. Close in under the sheltering rock, Buck made his nest. So snug and warm was it that he was loath to leave it when Francois distributed the fish, which he had first thawed over the fire. But when Buck finished his ration and returned, he found his nest occupied. A warning snarl told him that the trespasser was Spitz. Till now, Buck had avoided trouble with his enemy, but this was too much. The beast in him roared. He sprang upon Spitz with a fury which surprised them both, and Spitz particularly, for his whole experience with Buck had gone to teach him that his rival was an unusually timid dog who managed to hold his own only because of his great weight and size. Francois was surprised too. When they shot out in a tangle from the disrupted nest, he divined the cause of the trouble. "Aha!" he cried to Buck. "Give it to him, girl. Give it to him, the dirty thief." Spitz was equally willing. He was crying with sheer rage and eagerness as he circled back and forth for a chance to spring in. Buck was no less eager and no less cautious, as he likewise circled back and forth for the advantage. But it was then that the unexpected happened, the thing which projected their struggle for supremacy far into the future, past many a weary mile of trial and toil. An oath from Perrault, the resounding impact of cub upon the bony flame, and a shrill yelp of pain heralded the breaking forth of pandemonium. The camp was suddenly discovered to be alive with sulking fury forms, starving huskies, 4 or 5 score of them, who had scented the camp in for some Indian village. They had crept in while Buck and Spitz were fighting, and when the 2 men sprang upon them with stout clubs, they showed their teeth and fought back. They were crazed by the smell of the food. Perrault found one with head buried into the grub box. His club landed heavily on the ground ribs, and the grub box was capsized on the ground. On the instant, a score of the famished brutes were scrambling for the bread and bacon. The cubs fell upon them unheeded. They yelped and howled under the rain of boughs, but struggled nonetheless madly until the last crumb had been devoured. In the meantime, the astonished team dogs had burst out from their nests only to be seen upon by the fierce invaders. Never had Buck seen such dogs. It seemed as though their bones would burst through their skins. They were mere skeletons draped loosely in dragged hides with blazing eyes and slavered fangs. But the hunger madness made them terrifying. Irresistible. There was no opposing them. The team dogs were swept back against the cliff at the first onset. Buck was beset by 3 huskies, and in a trice his head and shoulders were ripped and slashed. The din was frightful. Billy was crying as usual. Dave and Sulkless, dripping blood from a score of wounds, were fighting bravely side by side. Joe was snapping like a demon. Once his teeth closed on the foreleg of the husky and he crunched down through the bone, Pike the Mangler leaped upon the crippled animal, breaking its neck with a quick dash of teeth and a jerk. Buck got a frothing adversary by the throat and was sprayed with the blood when his teeth sank through the jugular. The warm taste of it in his mouth goaded him to greater fierceness. He flung himself upon another, and at that same time felt teeth sting into his own throat. It was Spitz approaching him from the side. Perrault and Francois, having cleaned out their part of the camp, hurried to save their sled dogs. The wild wave of famished beasts rolled back before them, and Buck shook himself free. But it was only for a moment. The 2 men were compelled to run back to save the grub, upon which the huskies returned to the attack on the team. Bailey, terrified into bravery, sprang through the savage circle and fled away over the ice. Pike and Dum followed on his heels, with the rest of the team behind. As Buck drew himself together to spring after them, out of the tail of his eye he saw Spritz rush upon him with the evident intention of overthrowing him. Once off his feet and under the mass of huskies, there was no hope for him, but he braced himself to the shock of Spitz's charge, then joined the fight out on the lake. Later, the 9 team dogs gathered and sought shelter in the forest. Though unpersuaded, they were in a sorry plight. There was not one who was not wounded in 4 or 5 places, while some were wounded badly. Dub was badly injured in a hind leg. Dolly, the last husky added to the team at Daya, had badly torn throat. Joe had lost an eye, but Billy, the good-natured, with an ear chewed and rent to ribbons, cried and whimpered throughout the night. At daybreak, they limped wearily back to camp to find everyone gone and the 2 men in bad tempers. Fully half their grub supply was gone. The huskies had chewed through the sled lashings and canvas coverings. In fact, nothing, no matter how remotely edible, had escaped them. They had eaten a pair of Pro's moccasins, chunks out of the leather traces, and even 2 feet of lash from the end of Francois' whip. He broke from a mournful contemplation of it to look over his wounded dogs. "Ah, my friends," he said softly. "Maybe it make you a mad dog, those many bites. Maybe I'm a mad dog scared him. What you think, Pro?" The quarter shocked his head dubiously. With 400 miles of trail still between him and Dawson, he could ill afford to have madness break out among his dogs. 2 hours of cursing got the harnesses into shape, and the wound-stiffened team was under way, struggling painfully over the hardest part of the trail they had yet encountered, and for that matter the hardest between them and Dawson. The 30-mile river was wide open. Its wild water defended the frost, and it was in the eddies only and in the quiet places that the ice held at all. 6 days of exhausting toil were required to cover those 30 terrible miles. And terrible they were, for every foot of them was accomplished at the risk of life to dog and man. A dozen times, nosing the way, broke through the ice bridges, being saved by the long pole he carried, which he also held that it fell each time across the hole made by his body. But a cold snap was on, the thermometer registering 50 below zero, and each time he broke through, he was compelled for very life to build a fire and dry his garments. Nothing daunted him. It was because nothing daunted him that he had been chosen for government courier. He took all manner of risks, thrusting his little weazened face into the frost and struggling on from dim dawn to dark. He skirted the frowning shores on the rim ice that bent and crackled underfoot and upon which they dared not halt. Once the sled broke through with Dave and Buck, and they were half frozen and all but drowned by the time they were dragged out. The usual fire was necessary to save them. They were coated solidly with ice, and the two men kept them on the run around the fire, sweating and thawing, so close that they were singed by the flames. At another time, Spitz went through, dragging the whole team after him up to Buck, who strained backwards with all his strength, his forepaws on the slippery edge and the ice quivering and snapping all around. But behind him was Dave, likewise straining backward, and behind the sled was Francois, pulling till his tendons cracked. Again, the rim ice broke away before and behind, and there was no escape except up the cliff. Per had sealed it by a miracle, while Francois prayed for just that miracle, and with every thong and sledge lashing and the last bit of harness rove into a long rope, the dogs were hoisted one by one. To the cliff crest Francois came up at last, after the sled and load. There came the search for a place to descend, which descent was ultimately made by the aid of the river, with a quarter of a mile to the day's credit. By the time they made it to Hulungwene and good ice, Buck was played out. The rest of the dogs were in like condition, but Perrault, to make up lost time, pushed them late and early. The first day they covered 30 miles to the Big Salmon, the next day 35 more to the Little Salmon, the third day 40 miles, which brought them well toward the Five Fingers. Buck's feet were not so compact and hard at the feet of the Huskies as the feet of the Huskies. He had softened during many generations, since the day his wild ancestor was tamed by a cave dweller or riverman. All day long he limped in agony, and camp once made, lay down a dead dog. Hungry as he was, he would not move to receive his ration of fish, for which Francois had to bring to him. Also the dog diver rubbed back feet for half an hour each night, supper, and sacrificed the tops of his own moccasins to make 4 moccasins for Buck. This was a great relief, and Buck caused even the weazened face of Pro to twist itself into a grin one morning when Francois got the moccasins and Buck lay on his back, his 4 feet waving appealingly in the air, and refused to budge without them. Later his feet grew hard to the trail, and the worn-out footgear was thrown away. At the Pelly one morning, as they were harnessing up, Dolly, who had never been conspicuous for anything, went suddenly mad. She announced her condition by a long, heartbreaking wolf howl that sent every dog wrestling with fear, and then sprang straight for Buck. He had never seen a dog go mad, nor did he have any reason to fear madness, yet he knew that here was horror, and fled away from it in a panic. Straight away he raced, with Dolly panting and frothing, one leap behind, nor could she gain on him. So great was his terror, nor could he leave her. So great was her madness. He plunged through the wooden beast of the island, flew down to the lower end, crossed back the channel field with rough ice to another island, gained a third island, curved back to the main river, and in desperation started to cross it. And all the time, though he did not look, he could hear her snarling just one leap behind. Francois called to him in a quarter of a mile away, and he doubled back, still one leap ahead, gasping painfully for air and putting all his faith in that Francois would save him. The dog driver held the axe poised in his hand, and as Buck shot past him, the axe crashed down upon Mad Dolly's head. Buck staggered over against the sled, exhausted, sobbing for a breath, helpless. This was Spitz's opportunity. He sprang upon Buck, and twice his teeth sank into the unresisting foe, and ripped and tore the flesh to the bone. Then Francois's lash descended, and Buck had the satisfaction of watching Spitz receive the worst whipping as yet administered to any of the team. "One devil dat," Spitz remarked Burrows. "Some day him kill dat Buck." "Dat Buck too devil," said Francois. Reed joined her. "All day I'm gonna watch dat Buck, I know for sure. Listen, some fine day him gonna get mad and chew him that Spitz all up and spit him out in the snow. Sure I know." From then on, it was war between them. Spitz, as a lead dog, acknowledged master of the team, felt supremely threatened by this strange Southland dog, and strange Buck was to him. For of the many Southland dogs he had known, not one had shown up worthy in camp and on the trial. They were all too soft, dying under the toil, the frost, and the starvation. Buck was the exception. He alone endured and prospered, making the husky in strength, savagery, and cunning. Then he was a masterful dog. And what made him dangerous was the fact that the club of the man in the red sweater had knocked all blind pluck and rashness out of his desire for mastery. He was cunning and could bide his time with patience, that was nothing less than primitive. It was inevitable that the clash for leadership should come. Buck wanted in. He wanted it because it was his nature, because it had been gripped tight by that nameless pride of the tile and trace, that pride which holds dogs in the toil to the last gasp, which lures them to die joyfully in the harnesses and breaks their hearts if they are cut out of the harness. This was the pride of Dave as a wheel dog, of Soklas as he pulled with all of his strength, the pride that laid hold of them at break of camp, transforming them from sour and school brutes to straining, eager, ambitious creatures, the pride that spurred them on all day and dropped them at pitch of camp at night, letting them fall into gloomy unrest and uncontent. This was the pride that bore up Spitz and made him thrash the sled dogs who burdened the shriek in the traces or hid away at harness time in the morning. Likewise, it was this pride that made him fear Buck as a possible lead dog. And this was Buck's pride too. He openly threatened the other's leadership. He came between him and shrieks he should have punished. And he did it deliberately. One night there was a heavy snowfall, and in the morning Pike did not appear. He was securely hidden in his nest under a foot of snow. Francois called him and sought him in vain. Spitz was wild with wrath. He raged through the camp, smelling and digging in every likely place, snarling so frightfully that Pike heard and shivered in his hiding place. But when he was at last unearthed, and Spitz flew at him to punish him, Buck flew with equal rage in between. So unexpected was it, and so shrewdly managed, that Spitz was hurled backward off his feet. Pike, who had been trembling, took heart at this open mutiny and sprang upon his overthrown leader. Buck, to whom fair play was a forgotten code, likewise sprang upon Spitz. But Francois, chuckling at the incident, while unswerving in the administration of justice, brought his lash down upon Buck with all his might. This failed to drive Buck from his primitive rival, and the butt of the whip was brought into play. Half stunned by the blow, Buck was knocked backward, and the lash laid upon him again and again, while Spitz soundly pushed the many times off the offending Pike. That's where we're going to stop today, in the middle of chapter 3. And today's question for you is, how does the dog fight show that Buck is a more creative fighter than Spitz? How is Buck a more creative fighter than Spitz?